I want to take some time now to talk about the political history of the Gilded Age. Industrialization and urbanization did not only strain American society, they also strained its political system. It was to government, gradually, that America began to look to bring stability to the disorder of progress. Yet, American government was ill-equipped during much of this period to deal with these challenges. It responded with passivity and confusion. Its leaders were very mediocre men, concerned with issues irrelevant to the nation's most serious problems. For nearly 2 decades after Reconstruction, the political system was locked in a rigid stalemate, and so consequently the U.S. would enter a period of great political crisis in the 1890s. From a modern perspective, politics in the late 19th century looked very paradoxical to modern eyes. On the one hand, the two political parties enjoyed great strength and stability those years, but the federal government they each tried to control was doing very little of importance. People in those years engaged in political parties less from their interest in national issues and more based on their religious, ethnic, or regional sentiments. I'm an Northern Urban Irish, so I'm a Democrat. Or I'm a Southern White, so I'm a Democrat. It was more about cultural identity than any sort of policy position. The most striking feature of the late 19th century politics was its stability. From the end of Reconstruction to the late 1890s, the electorate was divided almost evenly between the Republicans and the Democrats. Loyalties fluctuated almost not at all. 16 states were solidly and consistently Republican. 14 states, mostly Southern, were solidly and consistently Democratic. Only 5 states were ever in doubt, and it was in those states that national elections were usually decided on the basis of voter turnout. So-called swing states, they're important today, and their importance began in this era. An example would be Ohio. A lot of presidents have come from Ohio because parties pick Ohioans thinking that that'll get a bigger turnout in Ohio, and Ohio might go for them in this election. Ohio is still a swing state. The Republicans won the presidency all but 2 times in these years, but that indicates a dominance of the Republicans that was not there. In the 5 elections beginning in 1876, the average popular vote margin was 1.5%. These were razor-thin elections. The congressional balance was similarly stable. The Republicans usually controlled the Senate in this era, and the Democrats usually controlled the House, with the number of seats shifting in elections very slightly. As striking as this balance between the parties was, individual loyalty to the parties was even more so. Voter turnout in presidential elections between 1860 and 1900 averaged 78% of all eligible voters. That is a good turnout, much higher than today. Party politics had a role in this era comparable to the role of spectator sports and mass entertainment today. You'll recall that those things emerged in the Gilded Age to fill people's leisure time, and politics was one of the things, even more so really than it is today. Now, political identification was almost as important to people as identification with a church or an ethnic group. What explains this loyalty? It was not the party's position on issues. Both were solidly committed to the corporate industrial economy, both parties. Both were hostile to economic radicalism and to social radicalism. The Democrats in the South identified with their triumph over Reconstruction, retrieving home rule. Republicans in the North identified themselves as the party of Lincoln and the preservation of union over slavery and treason. Democrats attracted certainly the white Southerners, but also Catholic voters, recent immigrants, and poorer workers. You'll notice there's a lot of overlap in those last 3. I might be a recent Irish immigrant, and I'm probably going to be Catholic. I am a recent immigrant, and I'm probably going to be poor. Republicans appealed to Northern Protestants and citizens of old stock, multi-generational Americans. Consequently, Republicans tended to favor temperance, laws controlling the consumption of alcohol, and nativism. Catholics and immigrants viewed this as an assault on them, rightly so. So party identification then was usually a reflection of vague cultural inclinations rather than some sort of economic consideration. The parties had no real economic policies at this point. Now, one reason the parties could avoid substantive issues was that the federal government really didn't do anything, or relatively little. It delivered the mail, it maintained a military, nothing like the one that we have today. It conducted foreign policy, and it collected, and nothing like the extensive foreign policy of today, and it collected taxes. That was about it. It had a few other few responsibilities and few institutions with which to do them. One important exception was the elaborate pension system maintained for veterans of the Civil War. At its peak, it was making payments to the elderly, to the majority of elderly male citizens of the North, and many of the widows and children as well. Many wanted to make this system universal, an old age pension for all. But this was difficult since the current system was corrupt and heavily influenced by patronage. Many reformers, so-called reformers, saw the elimination of the pension system as a way to fight corruption and party rule. Anyway, the pension system died out when the Civil War generation died. In most respects, the U.S. in this era was a modern society without a modern national state. The most powerful institutions were the courts and the political parties. Most leaders were more concerned with office, controlling patronage, than with policy. Both parties were dominated by bosses and machines whose chief concerns were controlling and dispensing jobs. Democrats relied on big city machines like Tammany Hall, while Republicans depended on strong statewide organizations like that of New York, controlled by Roscoe Conkling, or that of Pennsylvania, controlled by a guy named Matt Quay. And the power of the bosses had a significant effect on the power of the presidency. The bosses delivered the votes. The bosses made the presidents, and so they therefore had considerable power over what the president did. Besides great symbolic importance, however, the president could not do much except make appointments. About 100,000 jobs the president could fill, most of them in the post office, since that was the one really big government agency. But even in this role, they had to be careful to avoid offending various party factions. This was sometimes impossible, as the Hayes presidency proved. President Hayes was loathed immediately by Democrats. They referred to him as his fraudulency because of the contested election. But also, he was torn between two factions of Republicans. The stalwarts, the more conservative traditional Republicans led by Roscoe Conkling, and the half-breeds led by James G. Blaine, the plumed knight. I don't know why he was called that, but he was. Both of these characters, of course, played significant roles in the novel 1876. Technically, the stalwarts favored machine-style politics and patronage, while the half-breeds favored reform, some degree of reform. They were sort of half-hearted about it, but both really just wanted a bigger piece of the patronage pie. In trying to satisfy both, Hayes satisfied neither. Hayes' one substantive effort, a bid to create a civil service system, which would give these jobs based on merit, attracted no support from either party. His early announcement that he would not seek a second term weakened him further. The Republicans maintained the presidency in 1880 based on a ticket designed as a compromise between the stalwarts and the half-breeds. After a long convention deadlock, the Republicans nominated a dark horse half-breed, a compromise candidate, James Garfield from Ohio, note he's from Ohio, as president, and the stalwart and Conkling henchman Chester A. Arthur from New York as vice president. Along with the presidency, the Republicans captured both houses of Congress in 1880. Garfield tried to defy Conkling and the stalwarts in appointments and by showing support for civil service reform. A very nasty fight ensued. Garfield's reform efforts, however, became irrelevant because on July 2nd, 1881, only 4 months after taking office, he was shot in a D.C. railroad station by a deranged office seeker, a guy named Charles Guiteau, who shouted, "I am a stalwart and Arthur is president now." Arthur surprisingly tried, like Hayes and Garfield before him, to be independent of party politics and to reform the system. He was a stalwart, but he appeared very moved by Garfield's assassination, which was arguably caused by the spoils system. Guiteau killed him because he didn't get a job he felt he deserved. Arthur kept most of Garfield's appointments, therefore, and supported civil service reform legislation, which probably would have passed regardless. So in 1883, the Pendleton Act was passed, requiring competitive examination rather than patronage for a handful of government jobs. The number of jobs affected was small, but it grew over time, however, and by mid-20th century, most federal jobs were civil service jobs based on merit, not party patronage. Oh, and you have to ask me about Charles Guiteau in class because he is the craziest and most entertaining presidential assassin ever.